Well, good evening. It's good to see everybody out tonight, and I want to thank you very much for the chance again to speak to you. Now, if I get this one right, it won't so much be me speaking, but more of me getting out of the way and letting the scriptures speak to you. That being said, let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to spend a lot of time in 1 Samuel tonight. Spend a lot of time in chapters 24, 25, and 26, but we'll jump to at least one other spot. First place we're going to go is 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now, David, the king of Israel, did not ascend to the throne without what you might call street cred. Oh, you know what I mean, right? There's some leaders sometimes are forged in the fiery trials of life, tempered by the cold wash of pain, infused with wisdom that comes equally from failure and success. And sometimes one becomes a leader because he has a really good PR team and is pretty good at making speeches. Well, David was certainly not one of the latter. When David was talking to King Saul into letting him go fight against Goliath. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we're going to read verse 34. We learned that in his formative years, he was something of a farmhand / security guard, protecting his father's sheep. And he says there to King Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." So now here David is a slightly older young man, and we see him arguing with the king of Israel to let him go out and battle against this giant that every warrior in this king's army is scared to death of. Oh, and by the way, he eventually convinces him and goes out and beats the guy. The point is, this is one tough dude. David is a macho man's man. And if that's not macho enough, we read a few chapters later, we find David, we'll start at 24, we find David, the rightful king of Israel, roaming the countryside with a few hundred loyal men outsmarting and evading Saul at every turn. Because Saul had decided that David was a threat to him and his throne, and he had to be killed. Now, in this time period, chased and threatened by Saul, I want to focus the remainder of our time. I'd like to look at 3 different occurrences in David's life. And I want to explore what happened to him and how he reacted to it. And in the short time left after, I want to make a little bit of application for us. So turn with me, if you will, to chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. Chapter 24, I was close. Where we'll kind of jump into the middle of this mad chase around the countryside. And I want to start in verse 1. It says there, "When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, 'Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi.' Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave. And Saul went in to relieve himself," my version says. Now, David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts. That would be the innermost parts of the cave. You get the picture here? Embarrassing, right? Saul is about to be met by David, the one he's trying to kill, who has a bunch of mighty men around him, and he's in the most vulnerable position you could possibly be in. Well, it goes on in verse 4. "The men of David said to him, 'Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.' Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe." Okay, so here we've got the Lord's anointed in David versus the Lord's condemned in Saul. Saul has been told that he will be replaced. David was told that he will be the replacement. Not surprisingly, Saul didn't like that arrangement very much and is actively trying to kill David. And this is kind of the way things went in this at this time in the ancient world, that's a lot of times in countries, how kings were both, how kings both ascended to the throne and how they kept it. It was by killing the ones that would want to be there instead. Now seemingly, the Lord at this point has delivered Saul in a nicely wrapped little package to David. And right in this cave. And what do you suppose happened next? Well, incredibly, we read in verses 5 through 8 about David's reaction. And it says, afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words, and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave, and called after Saul, "My Lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed his face to the earth and paid homage. Now, not only that, but he goes on in these moments after coming out of the cave to passionately plead with his would-be murderer for peace and for a restored relationship. And I kind of read that and go, wait, what? Well, as we read from verse 16 until the end of the chapter, David's actions move Saul to regret his evil actions and to give up his rejection of God's chosen king. Now, you may have noticed that last part was very carefully worded, awkwardly worded in the presentation, but carefully worded nonetheless, because Saul's regret literally lasted from verse 16 to the end of the chapter. For a brief break, after a brief break, for an account of David dealing with yet another bad guy, we find in chapter 26 that the story picks up kind of in the same way that chapter 24 picked up, with Saul already having changed his mind. So we'll skip ahead chapter 26 for the moment. Chapter 26 and verses 1 and 2. They read almost identically to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 25, to just switch out some of the names of the places. It reads there, "Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon? So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, and with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph." And again, in this chapter, it's very clear who the good guy is, that would be David, and who the bad guy is, that would be Saul. In the preceding verses, we see David finds out about Saul's relapse, and he decides to visit his camp. Well, in verse 6, David asks 2 of his men, "Who will go down with me into the camp of Saul?" And Abishai, I gotta admit, I gotta kind of admire this guy. You know, he had the wrong idea, and David kind of sets him straight here a little bit, but he is loyal to his king, and he is ready to go at great peril to himself to prove it. He's a brave guy. And Abishai says, "I will go down with you." So, sure enough, they go down. They sneak through all the defenses until they get to the center of camp, where Saul is there, presumably surrounded by his king's guard. The elite guards would be around him. And this time, David has a little unsolicited help in making the decision. And in verse 8, Abishai tells him, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice." Of course, you can read in between the lines there, it's not because he's going to be nice and only strike him once, it's because he won't need more than one time. So I will not strike him twice. David's response, he says, "Who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" David then tells the men to take the king's spear, they take his water jug, and they both hightail it out of there. And they get to the top of this hill, and after a short distance, David calls out to Saul's company there. And again, the remaining verses are a lot like the ending verses of chapter 25, with David pleading his innocence and Saul replying with regret and repentance. Well, we looked at these two events together because they're just so similar. You know, we see David both learning and kind of teaching the same lesson in both instances. But sandwiched in between them is what really feels like a seminal moment in the life of David. This is one of those places in chapter 25 where it seems like the light bulb kind of comes on with David, and he at least remembers, if not learns, his place in all of the scheme of things. And he shows us what it is to be a humble servant of God. So let's briefly take a look at the happenings of chapter 25. You know, much like the other two chapters that we've looked at so far, verse 1 sets the scene for where David is and for what he's doing. We're told that after the death of Samuel, that David, in the first verse, that David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Verse 2 then continues, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now, the name of the man was Nabal, and his wife, and the name of his wife, Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and behaved badly. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, go up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. And they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servant and to your son David. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David. And they waited. Okay. Could you make a more polite and humble request than that? They asked him, this simple thing in the name of David. Now, I want to pause for just a moment and kind of remind ourselves just exactly who it is that's making this request. So look back with me, if you would, to chapter 18 of this same book, and it describes for us what happened after David defeated the giant Goliath. In verse 2, we read, this is 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 2. We read there, Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Okay, this sounds kind of harsh out of context. But what he had done is lifted him out of the household of a sheep herder and into the household of a king. In verse 5 it continues. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. So that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. David was the most loudly celebrated war hero in the whole country. While writing this lesson, it occurred to me that we haven't had a lot of examples of this in recent years. But depending on your age, you might think of somebody, right? If in World War II we had Patton and Bradley, maybe even Audie Murphy, these great war heroes that people would make movies about and everything else. If If Tom, my dear stepfather, was here, I might suggest that he think of somebody like George Washington or Ethan Allen, because I like to tease him. But if you're my age, it was General Norman Schwarzkopf. Remember when I was 10 or 11 years old, there was no more of a hero than that. Colin Powell and some of those in that particular conflict. But, all right, for a moment, let's go back to chapter 25. And think just for a moment, if this person, whoever you got in mind, stopped by the house and said, look, I'm in dire straits and I need some help. That's the situation that Nabal finds himself in, right here in chapter 25. So if we continue in verse 10 of chapter 25, we find Nabal's response. It says there, and Nabal answered David's servants, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and water and my meat that I have killed from my shears and give it to men who come from I don't know where? Does this sound to you like a serious question? I guess it could be, but judging from the tone of the conversation and from the fame of David in all of the country around, I'm guessing it was not. What is clear is that Nabal had not one thread of respect for David, the rightful king of this land, and had no thread of respect for the kindness that David had shown, that his servants had shown toward this man's shepherds. It's also very clear in this one, just like the last couple of stories we looked at, who's the good guy, that would be David, and who's the bad guy, and that would be Nabal. Well, David's men bring this news back to him. And believe it or not, he's kind of upset. And we know this because the first thing out of his mouth when he's told of the situation is, every man strap on his sword. He was going to, if not righteously, at least understandably, defend his honor. He had been given this great insult, and not just an insult, but why did they come to Nabal? Right? Because they were starving, because they needed supplies, because he was rightfully running from his life from a bad guy that wanted to kill him, and he was fighting for his life. Well, spoiler alert, he changes his mind before he does this thing. What was it that changed his mind? What was it that turned him from his indignation? Well, it was the honest and courageous rebuke of this woman, Abigail, Nabal's wife. We're not going to read the whole rest of the chapter out loud, but starting in verse 14, we find that one of those servants, so kindly and conscientiously treated by David's men, went and found Abigail. And you read this and you realize from the context of everything, he probably went and found Abigail because he figured, well, Nabal's crazy enough to get us all killed. She seems to be the sensible one, right? And he tells her about the whole thing. Abigail then gathers up a considerable amount of provisions as kind of a peace offering to David, and she goes out to meet him. We find in verse 22 that she came at exactly the right time. That David is standing there in front of his men, and he's about to explain exactly what he's going to do. And it reads there in verse 22, God do so to the enemies of David, and more also if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. Well, she continued on, but going down to verse 30, it says, When the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief, or pangs of conscience, for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord taking vengeance himself. Now this basically is a nice way of saying to the man with the rage and the sword, you're wrong. But what was David's response? In this situation, what would be a normal response? In this situation, if a man thinks he's right, I'm using the male version of that because we're talking about David, who is one, and because, we kind of have more of a problem with that sometimes, this whole stubborn pride thing. And, if a man thinks he's right, even after a rebuke like that, the most likely response is going to be, well, get out of my way, right? But let's face it, if a man thinks that maybe she's starting to make a little sense, and I might not be on good ground here, the most likely response is going to be something along the lines of, get out of my way, right? But not David. David says in verse 32, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt, and from avenging myself with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. That is such an awesome response, because it's such a response that just flies in the face of what we sometimes think of as this rough and tough macho man's man, right? Of course, you can read down through the rest of the chapter and see that the Lord is certainly capable of the vengeance that the Scriptures tell us that he claims for himself. When Nabal hears about the disaster that the wise actions of his wife just narrowly averts, he gets so excited that he apparently has a heart attack and dies. Yes, the Lord is more than capable of that vengeance. Okay, well, we've gone through these stories. I've got just 2 points. The first is that just like David learned, we need to do our jobs and let the Lord do his. Did you ever notice that in the Bible, when somebody gets mad and rebuked for it, from David here to Jonah to the non-prodigal son, when he's all angry about the father taking back the other son and the fatted calf, and you never made me a feast like that for my friends, and I've done all these good things. When that happens, generally speaking, their anger is a selfish one. Or like the lesson that I think maybe a couple months ago, if you can remember that. A lot of times our anger is of the petty kind because it's about us. It's about what's been done to me. It's about what honor has not been done to me. And it is indeed easy to find examples of what not to do in this regard, not only in the Scriptures, but in our own lives. Of course, as we discussed a couple months ago, if we wanted a better example of what to do in this regard, we need only look, of course, to Christ. He was beaten. He was rejected. He was spat upon. He was ridiculed. But what do we get from that? Father, forgive them. But disrespect his Father's house, as the sellers in the temple did, it's a whole different story. If we're going to please God, we have to shake off this selfish notion of pride and indignation that causes our hackles to raise every time that we're challenged in any way, and start placing all importance on God's cause, on His glory. Well, the second point is similar, but it requires a brief revisit to the beginning of this lesson. David was king, war hero, military leader, following of loyal warriors at his side. And, need we mention the whole grabbing a lion by its beard thing? You can almost hear the Davy Crockett-like theme playing in the background for David, right? That being said, I want to read a few quotes from this man's man. Some from these chapters, at least one from elsewhere. In 1 Samuel 24 and verse 6, his reaction to his finally a chance at revenge. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. In chapter 25 and verse 33, he says to Abigail after she tells him, you're wrong in what you're about to do. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from avenging myself with my own hand. Back in forward in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 13, after getting one of the nastiest tongue lashings you ever heard from Nathan, who had told him this story of this horrible man who had done horrible things. And David, at the end, of course, says, well, that's terrible. Who is this man? We need to punish him. We need to kill him. And Nathan said, you are the man. David's response, I have sinned against the Lord. David was not perfect. He was far from it. But his winning strategy, if you want to call it that, was not the confidence of knowing that he always had the answers. It was the humility of knowing that he did not. If there is something in your life that you know needs fixed, I want to suggest to you that it doesn't matter how you found out about it. Whether it was the humble and gentle plea like that of Abigail's, or thoroughly unpleasant raking over the coals like David got from the prophet Nathan. Either way, that knowledge is just as precious, and it is just as able to save your life, the more important life. But just having it is not enough. It's what you do next. Whether that means you need to give your life to Christ, whether that means you need to come back to Him, to reconcile with the brother or sister whom you've wronged, or who's wronged you. You can't let it go. Don't hang on to that stubborn pride. Don't hang on to that pride until it turns to regret. If we can help you in any way in that regard, either come back to Christ, to come to Him, to give you encouragement in our prayers with something that you're struggling with, please come forward. Let us do it as we stand and sing our own
Who at my door is standing?